Hey class, welcome back to another week of English 102. By now we are pretty far into Frankenstein. This week is an exciting chunk of reading. This is where we get to know a little bit more about the monster. I remember the first time I read this, middle school, high school, somewhere around there. I was really moved and kind of blown away by this particular section, volume 2 of the book. And I think you will be too. I think it's a far cry from especially how the monster is traditionally represented in media. In some ways, he is a lot more sympathetic of a character, and in other ways, he's a lot more terrifying of a character. But I'll kind of leave that up to you to sort through this week. By now, I've already posted your midterm grades and your grades from your area assignments. It did take me like an extra week to get those graded, so I apologize for that. But by and large, I was very, very impressed with them. And really, for the most part, I know no one failed or like got beneath a C on them, really, if you did, assuming you did the assignment, of course. So if you did it, you got great credit for it. Due to the like creative nature of the assignment, you were very much assessed on completion. Like if you did all of the things I asked for, you got a pretty good grade. The only thing I really took points off for were when things were missing, or there was, stuff that was obviously rushed, or, it was clear that you did not go through like the drafting process, stuff like that, or like some writing process statements were like only a page long when I said 2+ pages, stuff like that. That's really the only time I found myself taking points off. Along those lines, your midterm grades are also locked in. I don't think there's really going to be any surprises for any of you. At this point, you should know whether or not you've been doing the work. And if you haven't been doing the work, then you probably don't have a very good grade. But most of the people who are failing this course are not doing the work, so they're probably not watching this right now anyways. And if you are watching this, you're probably doing well. So I don't know who I'm really talking to here. A thing to be aware of is things will kind of start getting a little harder from here. And now that I have a better sense of where everyone's at, grading will probably be a little more rigorous because I have you in my clutches now and I know kind of what you're capable of. I've seen a lot of really great growth from the people who are showing up every week and doing these assignments. And, the people who have not been taking this course seriously, they're not doing as well, and things are going to get harder from here on out. Our Essay 2 is coming up, which is going to be a little more rigorous. Area X was a way to get our words flowing and our minds thinking. In Essay 2, I'm going to really start looking to see how you are able to apply and adapt the skills I have been teaching you in discussion boards and quizzes. Training wheels kind of start coming off. We will have about 1 or 2 more weeks with Frankenstein of like reading the actual text, though Frankenstein's the monster's shadow will loom over the rest of the course. And I guess Victor's smaller shadow will also loom over the rest of the course. So next week will be a real similar reading load to this week. We'll read the next 2 essays, and I'll talk more about essays because I have some questions about those coming up. And I do, not to sound like a broken record or a ChatGPT prompt, I am seeing some continued AI usage in various forms of nefarity. I'm not entirely sure nefarity is a word, but as an English professor, I feel comfortable making my own words up. You too can one day have that skill. So I did, and part of the reason why this lecture is a bit late was because I kind of had to deal with a rather major AI use last night where a student took another writer's work and rewrote it using ChatGPT. And I just also noticed, and I'll dive more into this, just more like some assignments that really just looked like a rewriting of the ChatGPT prompt. When I put the discussion board question into ChatGPT and it gave me an answer, like I could see how it was just kind of like a rewritten version. Again, I really have no way to confirm or deny that. But again, this job is by and large like English literature is by and large about pattern recognition. And like that's kind of what I'm trained to do. So if you get a comment on that on a discussion board, it's coming from a place of concern, and it is coming from a place of me recognizing a pattern and not necessarily me attempting to accuse you of something. But due to the nature of an online class, this is a really major issue, right? I know by and large, the majority of you are here to learn and to work. I mean, I see that effort very much in so much of your work. But there is a part of me that gets a little paranoid and think I'm just talking to a bunch of robots sometimes, which is in part due to the nature of teaching online. Like I don't actually ever get to know you. But this quote has been making the rounds. Why bother reading something no one bothered to write? Really, that says it all. Like, it creates like a very unfair workload on me to have to deal with these issues and not to be like, oh, me, but like realistically, right, that takes away from the time of I get to devote to everyone else in this class. If you don't have time to get something done, there's like no excuse to cheat, right? Because there's no penalty for turning in late work. And that's just kind of the way it is. But when these things pop up, it really affects everyone because they are fires I have to put out. And, if I let it get out of control when it becomes a pattern, a lot of things start unraveling. And I don't think the majority of us would like that to happen. Okay, last week's quiz. We had a good number of them. I'm going to try and go through them rather quickly so we're not here all day. Well, I'm not here all day. So question 1 is, am I doing something wrong by not reading the small text at the bottom of the page? Is that something you want us to do? And is there important information that we have to know? So this student, assuming you're reading the MIT PDF, is talking about these things. They're called footnotes. And all they are is like kind of explanatory notes that speak to certain issues within the text. Wrong is kind of right or wrong is not really the question, right? I'm not going to say I read every footnote. It is to your benefit to read the footnotes, but it's not mandatory, right? That's not something I'm going to like grade you on, in part because other people are reading different editions and some people don't have access to those things. I think it's good practice to check them out and see whether or not they're interesting to you. I think there's lots of interesting footnotes in here, but there's also a lot of footnotes in this text, and they can really detract from your reading process. So it might be confusing for you to pop in and out of the text. I know I can get a little lost, especially when I'm like reading a paragraph and then I have to read like a 3-paragraph footnote. It's really up to you. Why I would encourage you to do so is that I think, one, it helps you understand what's happening in these essays we're reading a little bit more, because these are all footnotes that were written by the editors of this book. They're not Mary Shelley's footnotes, which is usually when you read something, you're reading an author's footnotes, especially like in an essay. But these are all footnotes by people who know this book really well. You will notice certain biases that these authors have. There's definitely like patterns of thought in here, and there's definitely a way they want you to think about the text, which may detract from the way you want to think about the text if you let it shape you too much. But there is nothing in there you need to know in terms of things I'm going to ask you questions about, because that's a little unfair, in my opinion. But I think there are good things, and I think it would be a wise thing to pop in and out of those as you go. Sentence 2. So I've been grilling you a lot about... Sorry, I'm cracking open a cold one here. So I've been grilling you all a lot about grammar, right? And to reiterate, I'm trying to get across the idea that sentences are not just something that happens. They are constructed by writers to convey certain meanings, right? And I'm doing that so you see how you can use grammar to convey certain meanings. And I have, since I've started talking about that, seen a lot more usage of colons, semicolons in y'all's writing, which is exciting to me because that shows me that whether you're doing it consciously or subconsciously, you're picking up on these things I'm talking about. Semicolons historically are very weird. I am not a semicolon historian, because that sounds like an atrocious thing to be. If you know any semicolon historians, I would recommend you stay far away from them. They're not fun people to be around. So what's going on with this semicolon here? This student asked. Why is a semicolon placed in a sentence before the word and, connecting the sentences, but not in other sentences ending with a period before the word and, when it seems like they could go together just the same way? So semicolons, unlike other grammatical symbols, are almost always something that is stylistic. There are situations where they're like almost necessary, but they are never a mandatory thing. It is always a decision that you are making to blur the line between two sentences. And historically, they were used in, and historically they were a lot more prevalent than necessarily we use them now. So you're absolutely right. This sentence could also be, you would strike that, or correct. So all of these are correct. It is normally less common to use a in like current like English standards. It has fallen out of fashion to use a semicolon here, unless there's like a bunch of commas before that. So like we learned Latin and English, which was the most common language of the time, so that we might read the writings in those languages, right? See how we're getting like a lot of commas. So if this was a comma here, it gets a little bit hard to track visually. So that's a reason why you might put a semicolon before. This is called a conjunction, which means it's conjoining two clauses. Okay, so to be real quick, there's independent clauses and dependent clauses. Independent clauses, if you remember the Destiny's Child song, they're like independent women. They don't need no man. They can stand on their own. So an independent clause is a sentence that makes sense, a part of a sentence that makes sense. It has a subject and a predicate, is a complete sentence, a complete idea on its own. So a semicolon is always used to conjoin two independent clauses, where a colon might be used to join an independent and a dependent clause. That's getting a little in the weeds. I've kind of asked you to dig into that already. But that is why that is there, because she decided she wanted it there, though we wouldn't necessarily use that. And I'm assuming the second half of this sentence is complete, I guess. So that's what's going on with the semicolons. Like it's a lot of stylistic choice, though there are some situations where she would really need to do so, really need to use one, as when we have that weird sentence structure that has a colon, a sentence, an independent clause, followed by a colon, or it's as when we have that weird sentence structure I was talking about last week with the the colon that leads into the two sentences with a semicolon. That gets very complicated, but almost always there's a way to write around those things. But they are powerful tools to have in your toolkit. So question 3, one of the more common questions I get. I am struggling with the idea that Victor builds his creation and then is horrified by its look, immediately shunning it. Did he not see it the whole time he was collecting body parts and sewing them together? He thought that once these hideous mismatched corpse parts were shocked by lightning, they would magically look fine. It's supposed to be a question. This huge pivot point in the book is very weak, in my opinion. Are there any essays, texts, or evaluations that speak to this idea? Yes, I think we'll start seeing them this week in the essays. It's in the Elizabeth Bear essay, and I think it'll be in 2 more. So actually the final essay we read really focuses on it. But I think this is a hyperbolized version of a very human experience. Often it is more about the act of desiring than the thing we desire. I think especially, I've never been a young woman, but when I think about being a young man, all sorts of goal-oriented behavior seem to be more about the thrill of the hunt than necessarily what you're going after. And I think it's a very human experience to work very hard for something and ultimately realize that when you get the thing, it is not the thing you wanted. So I think Victor, being a young man who is chasing down ideals kind of has some blinders on, and it isn't until it actually works that it becomes real. Often there's a very large disconnect between the reality of the thing we're chasing and our idea of the thing we're chasing. Right. For instance, Drew, say hi to Drew. She is actually, I did chase her, and the reality was as good as I imagined, but she doesn't want to be here right now. So that's what I think's going on there. I think it's very easy to judge Victor because of how ridiculous and fantastic the situation is. But when we really reflect on what happens, especially if you think on, that kind of age frame from 16 to 27, when you kind of think you're physically and emotionally developed, but then all of a sudden realize around 27 that you don't really know what the hell you're doing. I think if you look at that as like a parallel, it's a lot easier to empathize with Victor, which is not something we see in these essays. And it's actually a huge problem I have with the approach of these essays, is that they forget how, and I mean, this from my lectures, they don't really seem to treat Victor as like a human, right? They kind of expect him to have all of this foresight that he couldn't possibly have. That doesn't undo the mistakes he does, but I think it kind of shows an error of feigned superiority that I really dislike. Thumbs up. I need to learn how to turn that off. Moving on. Question 4. Let's say Victor did come forth with how the monster was created and how the creature killed William. If you were a judge in that time period, would you hold Victor accountable and convict him of his brother's death? I thought this was an interesting question because I make you guys always think about this kind of stuff. So I thought it was fair for me to be put on the stand, as it were. So there is a difference between moral culpability and legal culpability, right? That, at least in our culture, we seem to value. So I certainly wouldn't hold Victor accountable and convict him of his brother's death legally, because there's no real legal standing, especially at this point in the reading. If you've gotten through any of the readings so far for this chapter, we know that the monster's murder of William was premeditated. That was murder, right? And we would call that murder 1, I think. I don't know. I'm not a lawyer. I'll judge whatever you want, but I'm not a judge legally. Only in very rare circumstances is someone's parent held accountable for the actions of their child. It does happen, in certain situations with school shootings we've seen recently, that parents have been found guilty of some sort of negligence. If Victor were to be accountable legally, anything, I guess it would probably be parental or child neglect, parental negligence. I have a essay or a lecture that's half written about how much the monster's thought process very much mirrors the thought process of this kind of current figure of the incel school shooter that I hope to get done this semester, but we'll see if that happens. I've been putting it off for a year, but it's half written. So in a certain regard, there would be some legal culpability, but I don't think I would personally hold Victor morally or legally truly accountable for William's death, knowing what I know about the monster. That doesn't mean he didn't play a major role in that happening, but I think if you look at things very objectively, whether or not it was right or wrong for him to abandon the monster, which, as we know, kind of happened, the monster fled also. It's, abandonment is kind of a tricky word there. So morally, there is moral implications. Legally, not so much in my book, but we also, I think you should revisit that question when you hear from the monster. Question 5. The dream that Victor has can be interpreted in several ways, and for some reason I have this feeling that it all stemmed from the loss of his mother. How do you interpret the dream? So this is going back to my question about Victor's dream, in which that happens right after the creation of the monster, or right after the monster comes alive. in which he is kissing Elizabeth and then she turns into like his dead mother. So I think this is interesting because it's like very, very Freudian in a way, right? So there's like this weird kind of Elizabeth is kind of being put into as a stand-in for his mother, and we kind of see that happening a lot emotionally. His mother provided all of this sort of emotional support. When she dies, Elizabeth kind of becomes his mother, but who is also his sister and who is also not his sister, which is all kind of icky. So there is something to be said about that we can learn about the way I think Victor views women. And it's always very interesting to me the way Shelley has written this as a woman. Because so much of the culture is in there. It's hard to tell if she's kind of embodying it, where she's embodying things and being a product of her culture, even a very forward-thinking part of her culture, and where she is critiquing it. But why this dream stood out to me is because I don't know how many of you have read 1984, but what's that dude's name there? Winston. He has the exact same dream in that book, except he is with a sex worker in his dream, and she kind of like crumbles into this like terrifying visage of like the dark mother, his actual mother, but also like symbolically like this kind of like dark mother figure. So to me, all of this kind of speaks to, again, like the knowledge of death. He knows that Victor knows that this act has undone the natural process of life. So there's all kinds of interesting things happening in that section for me. Question 6. Although Frankenstein is often spoken about for its warnings against unchecked scientific discoveries, I find myself more interested in the emotional dynamics of Victor. I tend to feel pity and understanding towards him more than disgust and anger. Is this a common experience when reading Frankenstein? Would an analysis of the emotional aspects of this book be relevant to any upcoming essays? So the way I approach this book and what I find interesting about this book is very much the emotional truth of this text. Honestly, I don't think the reason this text has stood the test of time is as much about its ideas about science as it is its understanding of human nature. And I think if we're being honest with ourselves, we should have more pity and understanding towards Victor than certainly people like Elizabeth Bear do. I think you're picking up on a pattern in how I feel about that essay, but I think you'll see it too. It is one thing to know when another person has erred, and it is another thing to cast judgment upon that person. While I am not a particularly religious person myself, I think often of the injunction of certain religious figures to judge not lest ye be judged, and to be wary of casting the first stone, which I see a lot in these essays. But certainly, at least in this next essay, you could certainly analyze the emotional aspects of this book in kind of the context of the prompt I'm providing. Question 7. I've enjoyed reading the supplemental texts that complement Frankenstein. Do you find them helpful for the overall understanding of the novel? Yes and no. So the reason I teach these alongside Frankenstein, like in parallel, as opposed to reading the novel and then reading the essays, is because it's kind of like a practical concern. Otherwise, I would have to assign like 8 essays or 4 essays a week after we read Frankenstein, and I feel like that might be a little underwhelming. So, this way we can kind of always be moving forward on something and always be getting new perspectives about the thing we're reading. I'm not sure that's the perfect way to do things, but I'm not sure there is a perfect way to do things. I have full confidence that at least the vast majority of you could come to your own understanding of the novel of Frankenstein. And I am at times worried that y'all can take these essays too seriously and it can maybe shape the way you read the text a little more than I would like. But that is an unfortunate byproduct of being in a class. So more importantly, I think these are excellent but accessible examples of the kind of essay I am trying to teach you how to write. They all, to varying degrees, have very clear arguments that are laid out. They all have different unique approaches. They're on different topics, but they're all like professional level essays, even though I have grievances with many of them, that are, in my opinion, great examples of the kinds of things you could write if you were to take this kind of writing to its logical extent, or if you were to continue in the writing world. These are the kinds of essays we are trying to teach you as an English major, and they're the kind of essays that English professors are publishing and trying to write. So I think they're also very great pedagogical tools and examples of good essays. Good question. Moving on. Discussion board. Just to remind you, I've created a monster and so can you by Cory Doctorow and Changing Conceptions of Human Nature by Mindshine and McCord are two essays that use Frankenstein as a launching board to talk more about significant issues that face humanity. The Doctorow essay, he uses the novel as a way to talk about our implicit consent in allowing technology to be misused for nefarious forces. Guess I'm all about the nefarious these days. In the Mindshine and McCord essay, they use the novel as a way to ever so slightly discuss whether or not an embryo can be classified as human, which has some unstated effects on how we might view something like abortion. So what I like about these essays is that they use Frankenstein, which is like a common cultural text, as a way to explore themes beyond that text, right? So in the 3-paragraph microessay, explore the following. What steps do each of these authors take in building their argument? What steps do each of these authors take in order to persuade you to agree with them? And whether or not you ultimately agree with their argument, which one of these authors crafts the better argument? So what's going on here is I am asking you to pay attention to, if you are able to comprehend what's happening at an argument level, and then to assess that argument level and figure out what style is more resonant. I have some great student examples. This is the ChatGPT response, and I was going to go through this, but I'm not going to bore us with it, because again, it's just kind of an inflated restatement of what I just said. So here are some good examples of like that summary section of the argument that I appreciated. That's incorrect. I did do some editing to these. It's apparently incorrect, just so everyone's looking as good as they can. So if you see some changes in your writings, you can feel free to ask why I made them. In the essay, I've created a monster and so can you, Cory Doctorow builds his argument by comparing Frankenstein with modern-day technology. Good, solid, clear sentence up front about the overview of the paper. Doctorow uses examples of inventors who would use their imagination creativity to doodle such things that seemed impossible, such as airplanes and trains. At one point, he states, fancy becomes a reality when enough of the necessary stuff is in place. He talks about the revolution of railroads and the changes that these technological advancements had changed the way of life for many, including forced labor. The few that gained riches were the few that put many people to work. He uses this to cement his argument that advancement in technology only benefited the rich. So I think this is a good overview, and it hits a lot of the major points. What I would say is it does miss the point that he kind of makes throughout, that these are all choices that people made, right? I think that element of choice and consent, the idea of opting in the way we do when we use a lot of social media, was spot on, was missing, but a lot of the major ideas present and clear in here. Here's an example of a good summary from Mindshine and McCord. So in the essay, Changing Conceptions of Human Nature, Jane Mindshine and Kate McCord argue that Frankenstein creates a monster that is not of human form. Really solid, top-level overview. They use the Greek philosopher Aristotle to support their argument of what makes a human. Mindshine and McCord state Aristotle insisted that becoming alive, and here you could actually... Mindshine and McCord state Aristotle insisted that becoming alive does not happen at one moment, but rather as a process over time. Mindshine and McCord, 216. This is their argument that the monster is not in fact human. Mindshine and McCord talk about humans must have two qualifying things: human form and the achievement of the developmental process. In Victor's case, he left the monster alone, inhibiting that developmental process, which did not allow the monster to become human. So again, a really solid overview of everything that happens. Some folks certainly went into more details and got into more of the nuances of the argument. But when I'm looking for a summary, this is like a good example of like the meat of a of an essay. And I think it's a good way, if your summaries aren't quite there yet, this is kind of what you should be working towards. Comparisons. Within both of these essays, the authors use Mary Shelley's Frankenstein to correlate more significant issues that humanity faces. They use the monster in the novel as a way to relate it to real-life monsters as we face every day. I think that's a really smart observation. Good parallel. Doctorow uses his essay to explain how technology is the real monster and we encourage it. He uses witty jokes, questionable in my opinion, and humor to build rapport with his readers. It's okay if you think they're funny, though. In his essay, he explores how throughout time technology has advanced, not because it's natural, but because people experimented. Mindshine and McCord use their essay to ask a simple question: what is considered human? This can be modernized to: what is considered a human and at what point? They use Aristotle and other prominent figures to build their case. So these are really clear overviews of each of the two's different writing styles. Doctorow is leaning hard on like modern, relatable things, and Mindshine and McCord are focused on this kind of timely, more philosophical, ontological question, and there is no humor or attempt at humor in the essay. Now we're kind of getting into what I found to be like the more interesting parts of these assignments and really focused more on like trying to learn more about how you all think, which is really what this is about. Overall, what I saw was kind of two schools of thoughts. The folks who really liked the Doctorow essay really resonated with the contemporary nature of it, right? He's talking about very modern things, and they found his like humor to be persuasive, which again, I did not. It was because he came for English teachers. And the people who fell into the Mindshine and McCord school of things really appreciated the clear formatting of her essay. She has a very traditional argument, a very classical argument, if you will, that is also rooted very much in classical thinking. So that was kind of what I was seeing as the main determining factors on what kind of spoke to people about these essays. To start off, someone very neutral. Both essays use plenty of examples to form and pinpoint their arguments. I find it hard to compare which one is better because they are arguing two completely different things. I think that's a fair place to be Switzerland on. I enjoyed reading both and found them both very compelling. Doctorow's essay was engaging because it felt more modern. He used modern-day examples like Facebook to compel his audience. Mindshine and McCord used a prominent historical figure to persuade the audience. Really smart point here. Aristotle lived hundreds and hundreds of years ago, but his belief of what makes a human can still be relevant in modern times. And that's true. Like, Aristotle is one of the most monumental thinkers, not necessarily because of his ideas, because of how his ideas have evolved throughout time. Without getting into like a huge spiel, his thoughts were very much appropriated by the church and kind of became a huge part of the canon and the way, Western, and shaped the way education would play out and shaped our values today. But we don't really have time to get into that. So for the folks who are into Mindshine and McCord, who I sometimes call Eminem, ultimately I think Mindshine and McCord crafted the better argument. While both pieces are well written, changing conceptions of human nature is better organized and more focused. I definitely agree with that. Their extensive use of open questions invites the reader to think critically and deeply engage with their essay. And while both essays, articles introduce complex academic concepts, Mindshine and McCord managed to do so in a more accessible way, making Aristotelian philosophy's concept of man easy to grasp. I do think they did a very good job of breaking down Aristotle's kind of ontology here. Despite the Socratic style, their opinions are stated clearly. The creature is not an actual human, where Doctorow's point tends to get a little lost in his jargon and list of historical events, with the exception of his final sentences. I tend to agree. Mindshine and McCord are more straightforward throughout, even with all the open questions and posing of possibilities, and that gives them the edge. Another student wrote, for me, because of my background in science and health, I found Mindshine and McCord's argument more convincing. Even though Doctorow's essay was fun to read and easy to understand, I connected more with the questions about humanity, embryos, and science in Mindshine and McCord's essay. Their use of scientific evidence and the way they tackled the questions felt more meaningful to me. I agree, the kind of flippancy of Doctorow kind of made me question his seriousness. Both essays were good, but Mindshine and McCord's argument spoke to me because it deals with issues that are important in the health field, like how we define life and what it means to be human. For me, another thing is that I have a Christian worldview, and I believe that life begins before the womb. So what I appreciated about this response was this student's ability to, whether or not they ultimately agreed with Mindshine and McCord's, ultimate point, which is really about where human life begins, and the student having a different point of view on that, or at least arriving to a different conclusion, that they were able to assess this argument for what it was. And that's really what important skill that we need to have these days. And I think it's a skill that is very much lost in the current political climate. I'm not going to get political climate or tell you what to think politically, but I've noticed a lot of people caring more about hearing what they want to hear than necessarily thinking about the logic of what they're hearing very much on both sides, right? Moving on to Pro Doctoro. I do agree with all the points these authors are trying to make. I would categorically state that Doctorow wrote the better essay, as he managed to keep my undivided attention throughout his essay, while I found Mindshine and McCord's essay to be more difficult to power through. I'd be careful saying categorically about anything in an English class. And I watch a lot of garbage on TikTok that keeps my attention, so I don't know if that's always the best litmus test. But well-worded, well-argued, Doctorow presented an easily comprehensible argument, avoiding excessive or monotonous writing. That's true. His list of our reactions to technology was insightful, and I wholeheartedly concurred with his reasoning, particularly his observation that people over 40 have negative perceptions of new technologies. Working for some Gen X people at my bookstore, I can totally agree with that. I was also fascinated with how the NSA buys our personal information from social media websites and what they ultimately do. So what I see here is someone reacting very much to the engaging tone of Doctorow, which is really, an important part of an essay. I know that's kind of contradicting what I was just saying, but your ability to create tension and keep your reader interested is very important. And, I get it. I have like a philosophy background. So me following along with like Aristotle's ideas is kind of entertaining for me. It's a little more entertaining than listening to some guy tell me not to use Facebook, because I got to be on Facebook Marketplace to find the deals, right? I'm addicted to Facebook Marketplace. I do have a Facebook Marketplace problem, and my partner does have a weekly Facebook Marketplace intervention for me, but you don't need to know about that. Next one, ultimately, both authors provide valuable insights, but I find Doctorow's argument more immediate and relatable because it directly addresses current technology concerns. I think that's a valid reason to be engaged with the writing. His essay invites readers to reflect on the implications of our choices regarding technology, while leaving space for us to find our own deeper philosophical questions. In contrast, Mindshine McCord's argument prompts a thoughtful examination of what defines humanity. It feels less familiar. I think that's true. It is incredibly kind of abstract, this idea of, when does one truly come into being and what does it mean to be embodied? It is, and they don't really give you they give you plenty of examples within the context of Frankenstein, but, there are certainly contemporary ideas she could be bringing in that might be a little more exciting and engaging. Their exploration of ethical issues surrounding embryonic status and rights is compelling, but for me, it doesn't hit as close to home as Doctorow's warnings of the misuse of technology. I think that's a valid criticism. There is this objective distance that I really appreciate and to me resonates as being a little more objective, where Doctorow's very, very subjective in his points of views. He literally will bring up his own personal things that he does or doesn't do, which is something that does make someone more relatable. So from that kind of ethos point of view, it seems, that's what really drew people to Doctorow, was his kind of entertaining ethos and his kind of emotional appeals, because he's always kind of talking about how bad our use of technology is or how misused technology has been, where Mindshine and McCord are taking this very logical or logos point of view that is very much presents itself as objective and is really about following logical conclusions. So again, there's no wrong way, even if I was poking fun at Doctorow. There's no wrong answer here. I just like to let you know where I'm coming from and what I appreciate. But that doesn't have to be what you appreciate. And everyone who did this had very good reasons for liking or disliking who they ultimately chose as being more effective. So that is all I have for today. I'm sorry this video is up a little bit late. If this, well, it doesn't make any sense to say this is the end of the video, but for future reference, if I'm ever late putting up a video, just note that on the quiz if you need to take it before it's due Wednesday. I know these take a little bit of time to watch, and then just promise me you'll watch the lecture at a later time. Just say, hey, you didn't have this up and I need to take the quiz, and then we'll be chill. All right, that's all I have for this week. You all have a good one, and I will talk to you soon.